We cannot find anywhere in this vast literature the evidence that HIV causes AIDS, that AIDS is a contagious disease, or that it even sexually transmitted.
If HIV were actually doing anything, making people sick, there would indeed be viremia, meaning millions of whole viruses. In fact, nobody has ever observed even one of them.
In my judgment, and to the best of my reviewing of the current literature on that subject, I've never seen a clear demonstration, of a direct isolation of HIV from patients.
It's been isolated by thousands of laboratories throughout the world. It's probably the best studied virus of any viral pathogen in the history of human diseases. So to say that it doesn't exist and it hasn't been isolated is beyond preposterous.
And my apologies, but it's actually storming right now, but I got to get this thing taped, so we're going to keep going. So let's get a little Lysander Spooner fix. We are still reading from his book, Vices Are Not Crimes, A Vindication of Moral Liberty, and we are on section 11. Here we go. Such a thing as a government, formed by voluntary association, would never have been thought of if the object proposed had been the punishment of all vices, impartially, because nobody wants such an institution, or would voluntarily submit to it. But a government formed by voluntary association for the punishment of all crimes is a reasonable matter, because everybody wants protection for himself against all crimes by others, and also acknowledges the justice of his own punishment if he commits a crime. Welcome to episode 21 of the Exit Your Matrix show. We are now halfway through the 14 techniques of mind control, and today we'll be going into the 8th of these manipulation tools. As I've prepared for these, I've often thought that the topic for that particular episode was the most challenging to condense because of the vast amount of information. But I think this one's the winner so far. And as I was researching, I came across thread after thread, meaningful ones, that I was so tempted to tug at. And as I mentioned before, the foundation of the content in all of my shows is Mark Passio's work on whatonearthishappening.com. And just to give you a sense of the enormity here, he covered food and medicine over the course of 4 episodes of his 2-hour shows. So let's do this. We're now halfway through the 14 techniques of mind control, and today we'll be going into the 8th of these manipulation tools: food, as well as nutrition, and medicine. First up, let's tackle food and nutrition. In many ways, we have a lot of control over what goes into our bodies. And notice I say in many ways because in many very important ways, we don't have a say. And on the subject of things directly impacting our bodies and health, I've got to jump a grenade straight out of the gate here because there's a big topic that seems to be widely unrecognized, or at least ignored, and, well, let me use this brief snippet that will be familiar to those of you who have been around for a while to introduce this subject.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
So here it is. One of the oldest conspiracy theories is chemtrails, or cloud seeding, or geoengineering, or weather modification, whatever term you prefer. And I hope you're up to speed on the reality of weather modification because this work has been going on for 50 years, even if the official line is that it's only been research. And my response to that is to look up, because looking here is surprisingly unhelpful. Seriously though, try it. These are pictures I've taken, and those don't look like any clouds I ever saw growing up. And let's set the I can quote the anointed expert game aside and go back to a very early episode where I called on you to use probabilistic thinking. In other words, when you're aware that investigation, at the very least, on this topic has been going on for half a century, and you couple that with what you can see with your very own eyes, what do you think is probably going on? But I digress, so just take some time to noodle on that one. So the best way I know to present a compelling story around food and nutrition as a mechanism of mind control is to touch briefly on some of what I think are some very important aspects, what I'll call effects, and then go into detail on one particular item that I'll bet you've never heard of, but is easily the biggest find I've come across on the subject of food and nutrition. What I'll call a cause, a major one. Second, it prompts huge questions about many foundational topics around food and the business of food. And third, I believe it will show the true nature and character of the forces behind the caloric curtain. Clever, huh? And I provided references and links for you in the description, and my hope is that this will prompt you to take the admittedly narrow, but I think critical, list of topics I'm touching on and do your own research, and through your own thinking, come up with your own conclusions. In my curation of this information, I'm hoping you'll discover what to me is the more interesting and insightful perspective, the agenda. And there is most certainly a food agenda, just like there's a medical agenda and a national security agenda and a schooling agenda and on and on and on. So whether or not Hippocrates said it, it's still the perfect opener for this topic, and in whatever form you hear it, it's this. Your food should be your medicine, and your medicine should be your food. Or, I think this also applies, chances are you'll become what you consume. And I say chances are because that's not guaranteed, but likely. We all know the people who smoked cigarettes all their lives and ate fast food and lived to be 95. So let me do a quick tour de force through some of what I'm calling those effects of the food agenda. We're talking chemical pesticides, additives, preservatives, and dyes. The implications of packaging, such as microplastics and waste. Excess refined sugar, excess refined flour, artificial sweeteners, and as an aside, if you weren't aware, those are excitotoxins, which can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause the death of healthy nerve cells and excessively high levels of healthy neurotransmitters, which can cause a lot of issues. Oils, especially hydrogenated oils. Heart disease, which increasingly looks to be caused by the grooving of arteries that is dietarily caused, and not by the presence of cholesterol by itself. And that brings up this whole statin-lowering pharmaceutical question, which is just starting to emerge. Of course, after the big profits have been made. Fluoride, which, as you might know, is a byproduct of fertilizer manufacturing. GMOs, factory farming, antibiotics and growth hormones, questions around the necessity and benefit or potential harm of pasteurization and homogenization. Deceptive food labeling. So for example, when you breathe a sigh of relief when you see a label that says natural flavors, what does that really mean? Industrial large-scale farming practices. And of course, I could go on and on and on and on. So here is one of the underlying causes of the way the whole food and nutrition scheme has played out that I had absolutely no knowledge of, and it absolutely blew me away. And quick aside, I mention it from time to time, but this is yet another incident of what I interpret as synchronicity, because I was just browsing through the ARC drive when I came across this. Or perhaps it's better stated that it was put in my path. What we're talking about is called Codex Alimentarius, and I had to fight my initial resistance to watching it because I was a little intimidated by the title, but it turns out it's just Latin for food code. Talk about getting to underlying causal factors. Take a look at the compilation I put together from two of the foremost experts on this subject to get a sense of what appears to be arguably the single biggest force in our modern food production system, at least that I've come across.
Let me give you a brief rundown of Codex then. Here's the history of Codex Alimentarius before 1962. The Austro-Hungarian Empire said, we need rules by which the courts can rule on cases involving food. So we'll have regulations and rules that the courts will enforce. That's how they get their weight. That was called the Codex Alimentarius, and it was put into place around 1893. and lasted until the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the First World War. So the idea was there in the Germanic tradition. So they started promulgating their rules and regulations, and they were voluntary. They were sort of guidelines. Now, Codex Alimentarius Commission is administered by the World Health Organization, WHO, and the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. They fund Codex and they run it at the request of the UN. So after the Second World War, the Nuremberg tribunals were held. One of the people found guilty of crimes against humanity was the president of a huge industrial megalith called IG Farben. So when he got out of jail, he went to his UN buddies and he said, "Have I got an idea for you? If we take over food worldwide, we have power worldwide." And so they created a trade commission. That's a very important pair of words, a trade commission called the Codex Alimentarius Commission. It is not a public health commission. It is not a consumer protection commission. It is a trade commission. They said in 1962, we're going to work toward total global implementation of Codex Alimentarius on December 31st, 2009. Codex has promulgated well over 4,000 guidelines, standards, and regulations on everything which can legally be put into your mouth, with the exception of pharmaceuticals. So we're talking about an industry-dominated, regulation-setting organization, but if it has no legal standing, who cares? The World Trade Organization, you see, accepted Codex when the World Trade Organization was formed in 1994. If two countries go into the World Trade Organization dispute resolution process, and one of them is Codex compliant, and one of them is not Codex compliant, the one that is Codex compliant automatically wins regardless of the merit of the case. People are using Codex compliance as a weapon in a much bigger economic battle. So, every country in the world is racing to do what? To become Codex compliant.
The Codex was actually started in 1962, and I'm quite prepared to believe that the people who originally dreamed up the concept were, erring on the side of benevolence. It was only after the likes of Monsanto and the likes of the pharmaceutical industry saw the potential for reaping the benefits of Codex that they started to get on board here. And of course, what we're talking about here is organizations that have basically bottomless pockets. Codex serves the economic interests of Big Pharma, and what is really a concern is that the World Trade Organization will implement Codex using Napoleonic law. Now, I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's hardly anybody in the room who knows what Napoleonic law is, because it's something that hasn't existed in the UK since 1215. Because in the UK, since Magna Carta, we've had common law. And what common law is that unless something is specifically banned, it's okay. Right? So unless something is specifically mentioned in a piece of legislation to outlaw it, it's okay. Napoleonic law is completely the opposite. Unless something is specifically mentioned, it's banned. And the way the pharmaceutical companies work and the way the food companies work is what they're trying to do with the Codex committees is make the testing process so outrageous and outrageously expensive that the only people that can afford to get things on the approved list will be the Monsantos and the pharmaceutical companies. Nobody else will be able to afford to go through the rigorous tests that you have to go through to get a product onto the approved list.
Wow. I mean, wow. Were you aware of that? I mean, is that not shocking? But surprising? Nah, not so much. So let me take a moment, dear people, to implore you, please subscribe, like, share, give me a thumbs up, and come on. There's no harm in liking, sharing, or giving this a thumbs up. In doing so, you'll be helping me increase the reach of this channel and get this information into more minds.